Alright, it's set review time. Y'all already know. New set coming out. Super exciting. Always love doing these. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So, first things first, we have our fire set review. We're going to go in binder order. We have Ward. Ward is a 3CP EX forward with 8,000 power. It has a downside. You can only pay with fire to cast him. And when he enters the field, choose a forward, deal it 7,000 damage. I think this is just a straight up better version of Forza for Megissa, and not a lot else. The EX burst is fantastic. I think the fact you can actually cast him and get the ability is great. He's not going to be an all-star. You're losing 1,000 power, but that doesn't matter in Megissa anyway because you're trying to swarm the field. And the fire CP thing is like the minorest of minor downsides. So I think he'll see play, but he's not going to be a star in any particular deck. Pretty simple overall. Edgar. Edgar's a really interesting card. So 3CP backup, Job King, super relevant because it means it's both a a Claris target and a Sarah target, which is really good. Fire in particular has really not had a good Sarah target. Category is WAF, which notably is not 6. Any WAF character is only only category WAF. So this won't go in a 6 deck. Not that you'd want to play him in a 6 deck. I mean, the reason to play 6 is 5 CP Edgar. This obviously would name clash with that. When Edgar enters the field, you can play a character of cost 2 or less from your hand onto the field. If that is live, he is effectively a 1 CP backup. Notably, its character doesn't have to play a forward. Not that like Palom and Porum are still great cards. Rydia is still a good card. That would still play potentially the Kolka engine. A lot of backups. The new Lena, I think, is another target you could very easily want to deploy. 2 or less means you can play any version of Princess Sarah you come to mind. This will allow you to cheat in backups off color, which is really interesting. And then you can also tap him and sack him to do it again. At which point he's kind of been a 4 CP. He's generated 4 CP worth of characters while being a 3 CP backup, so he's actually paid for more than himself. I don't think if he was missing that second text, I still think he is the best Fire King. Granted, there are situations you have to have enough 2-cost characters for it to be worth it. But previously, if you wanted to fire Sarah target, you played the old Edgar that just had no text on him. This is just a straight better version of that card. So I think this card is really good. Get some foils because I think the job and the attribute along with the text are good enough to see quite a bit of constructed play. This is a really good backup. Flame Serpent General Gadalar. If you control 2 or more fire characters, the cost required to cast him is reduced by 2. Trivially easy. Just get 2 fire backups down, and then you can tap them both to play them. Flame Serpent General Gadalar can attack twice in the same turn. You can pay 2 fire to activate him, or you can sacrifice a fire backup to activate him. There's some niche scenarios where like activating him can dodge removal from like an ice deck that can break a dull forward, or like a lot of earth cards will break dull forwards. Kind of makes him a decent little blocker potentially against an ice or lightning deck. But overall, none of this text excites me. I think that like attacking twice on a character without haste is just like almost irrelevant as text. If it really would matter, like the game's over anyway. And I don't think it's a very good aggressive card because you probably don't want to cast him for 4. Like to get the discount on this guy is actually kind of important. So I don't really see a home for this guy. I mean, I guess you could like play him in like a mono fire Garland deck and then just like sack 5 backups to draw like play him for 2 and then draw 5, but then you're sacrificing all of your backups. Like, is that really worth it? Is that where we're at in Final Fantasy these days? Probably not. Maybe you do that to like draw into Amaterasu or something. Just like activating a character is not good enough to be worth sacrificing a backup. Ultimately, it's kind of what it boils down to. Cyan. Cyan is our first legend. When he enters the field, you can pay X. 3 CP, Samurai, Category 6. All are relevant. but we'll get into more of that later. So you can pay X. When you do so, you get a crystal for each CP paid as X. The max you can pay is 5. So already this is like interesting because the general consensus is that if you can use the crystal, they're worth about a CP and a half. That said, if you spend the CP on a crystal and you don't actually use the crystal, then you're kind of not getting any value out of it. So that's why it's like generally considered to be worth less than 2 CP, but usually you can get more than one CP worth of value out of it. So as long as you can use the 5 crystals, cyan generating 5 crystals actually is a net positive relative to the expected value of those crystals. That said, 5 crystals is a lot, like to the point where early crystal payoffs, you were kind of looking for like 2 or 3. 5, we need better crystal users than we already have. Thankfully, cyan already takes care of some of that. So for 1 crystal, cyan gains 3,000 power to the end of the turn. This is not bad. This basically says that cyan doesn't die to damage-based removal once you get the crystals off of him, which is important because we're investing quite a bit in making cyan good. If cyan needs to stick around to use his own abilities, then that helps. For a crystal, you can choose a forward and deal it 3,000 damage. Now, notably, this is a little bit below rate. If you say that the crystal you generate with cyan costs 1 CP, a 1 CP summon is about, we've established right now it's 5,000 damage. That said, this doesn't use a card. This just spends a crystal from a guy on the field. So that's really, really not as bad as it seems. And lastly, you can pay 5 crystals to do 9,000 damage to all the forwards opponent controls. So this is another fire board wipe. If you play cyan, gain 5 crystals, and then sack the 5 crystals, you're doing 9,000 damage to all forwards opponent controls. That's basically Susano's text. Is that worth it? Well, the interesting thing about that is that there is no restriction on that. This can be done on either player's turn, so your opponent can try to pass, you can spend the crystals. You kind of just get to suspend a board wipe over your opponent they have to just deal with. Compared to something like Shinryu, where you have to do it on your turn, or anything else, I think he's really good. I think he will see play. I think the question is where. He is a 3 CP fire card, and something that's very interesting is that because the damage comes in little pockets, you can go Megissa, ping Megissa, bring out Cyan, discard 2 cards, and Cyan now has 2 Megissa pings basically stashed up at that point. It's kind of like being able to do the Hedgehog Pie thing without having to actually cast the Hedgehog Pies, which is actually really valuable then because you have two full Megissa pings before the Cyan burns himself out. But even there, it's kind of like instead of going for like an Alfino or a Bosch, you're going for guaranteed Megissa moving forward. You could theoretically go in 6, but the problem with 6 as a deck right now is that you have to sacrifice some names to the backups. And currently right now, the names we sacrifice are Setzer has interesting cards we could play, but we don't because the Setzer backup is critical to what 6 as a deck is doing. Sid is not a name we're sacrificing. We're not sacrificing Interceptor. But then there's Cyan and Shadows are in there as 2 CP backups just because there is no other option. You can't run a Sabin backup because they don't exist. We're not running an Edgar backup because Edgar is the most important forward in the deck on the fire side. That's why we're playing fire. We can't run Locke because Locke is the reason that the current 50 character 6 deck exists. You can run Terra on the ice side, but again, you probably want more fire backups than ice backups in 6 anyway, to my experience. Just because it's kind of more important to be able to tap the one backup to play the Cyan down. There are no water backups you want to play. So you're kind of just in this situation where you just have to deal with it. And I think ultimately the Cyan is replaceable. This doesn't do anything that Sabin isn't already doing for the deck. So I think this more becomes a mono fire piece, or maybe even a samurai piece, rather than anything in particular. Like I said, it's going to go great in Megissa, which I'm not particularly happy about. I just don't like Megissa as a deck or a concept. So the fact that this goes so cleanly in there just doesn't excite me at all. But that is probably the most likely home for it, at least in the short term. Black Mage. So we have a lot more standard unit 14 characters. That's always really interesting thanks to the Grahatia. Standard unit forwards are not super exciting usually. Let's see what Black Mage does. So 3 CP, standard unit. Uh, card name Black Mage is not good. You really need job Black Mage for that to matter. None of the actual Black Mage support cares about name Black Mage. When she enters the field, you can pay 1. If you do so, gain a crystal. It's fine. You can spend a crystal to give her 1,000 power, and when she attacks, choose a forward, deal it 5,000 damage. It's limited fodder. It'll be fine there. 3CP 8K that also kind of kills some, like doubles as a removal spell is acceptable enough. If you ever happen to get her and Cyan, she can help you refuel Cyan. Cyan can fuel her. But in general, that's like about the only real home for. I don't think we're playing her in anything else. Samurai. Okay, so this is this is the cycle of standard unit backups this set. Notably, they're all category 14, which is a very big deal because there were actually some elements that did not have good category 14 backups, and actually, I think Fire. Fire had Samurai. Wind had like Ninja. Lightning only really had Weaver that it wanted to play. Ice only really had Armor. Like you see, like a lot of different elements that just didn't have that. So more standard unit 14 backups is good. When Samurai enters the field, gain a crystal. Finally, we have backups to generate crystals that aren't those awful ones from Opus 15. That said, 3 CP generated crystal is not good enough, so this next line of text has to do a lot of heavy lifting. When it enters the field, if you control 3 or less backups, draw 1 card. So this is a very strange one, because it's kind of antithetical to what backups kind of do. If you play backups, you kind of want to ramp them out and do things. And to be fair, if you play this as your second or third backup, it is a 1 CP backup, which is fantastic. If you play it as your first backup, it's a 2 CP backup. But if you play it as your fourth or fifth backup, it's a 3 CP backup with no text other than gaining a crystal, which will feel absolutely horrible. I believe that like in Magic, the equivalent is, what is it? It's like a fast land is what they call it, where it's like if it comes in untapped, if you have less than 3 lands, it's kind of what they're going for with this. I think it's interesting. I think they're going to see play, especially like the name here is relevant as well. Tenzen is still a good card as it turns out. I think the deck building requirement of playing a bunch of Samurais is still a lot, but the more good Samurais that get printed, the better that deck becomes still, and this is a good card that we'll see some play somewhere. So keep an eye on it for sure. The 3 also could be relevant for a card later, although I don't think so. Shadow. So this is an interesting one. Shadow is the other legend of the set along with Cyan. It's a 7 CP forward. Warp 3 for 1. That is a long time. Warp 3, generally, any card that says more than Warp 2, I kind of ignore the Warp text. Thankfully, there is an alternate thing here, which is at the end of each of your turns, if 1 or more Warp counters are on Shadow, remove a Warp counter. For each Category 6 forward you control, this will only trigger if Shadow is removed from the game. This is actually really, really important because the second effect of Shadow is when Shadow enters the field, discard your hand, then draw 2 cards. So this is very powerful, but very weird. First thing of note here is that if Shadow enters due to his own warp without using his ability, he's horrible. He essentially just mills you for 2 cards, because even if you have no cards when you start your turn, you'll draw before Shadow's going to enter the field. So you have to either cast a summon to empty your hand, or have like a new Morrow you can revive in the break zone at instant speed in order to not have Shadow discard your hand for nothing. That said, he does say draw 2 cards, which is very good. I think there's even a world where you could like cast him in 6 with a lock on the field, or cast him at 7. You go tap 5 backups, pitch a card, go Shadow Lock, draw 3 cards, and you have a big 9K with 3 cards in hand, plenty going on still. I don't think that's the most likely thing. I think you're still going to want to warp him if you play him in a category 6 deck, but there we're still running into the issue of some number of names need to get sacrificed to the backup gods, and there's only 2 in Fire that are worth sacrificing, and Shadow happens to be one of them. I'm going to give it a try. I think that there's definitely like interesting things you can do with him. I think he definitely fits in like 6 more easily than Cyan, but not that easily. The other thing that's interesting about him that we can consider is actually, I think there was a very slept on Firewind 6 deck at the end of last set that people were kind of starting to catch on to, where you would run Edgar Sabin, number 24, Terra, as like your category 6 engine. And all those cards are independently pretty good. You run Bismarck, so you could do, if you had Bismarck 24, you could 24 cleave your opponent on your opponent's turn. Edgar says you can do a 7k cleave that can't be reduced every single turn. Just a very good combination of cards to use. This would fit in there because we're not using Shadow in that deck. You probably would use Interceptor still just because haste on demand is valuable. Wind is the right element for running something like a Vayne. You could run a couple other Fire Warp cards. I'm thinking something, or other warp cards you could run like a Sophie, a Charlotta. There's maybe something there in Firewind, which I think is maybe actually the best home for this. I'm gonna try him in both. I don't have super high expectations in 6 title, but I do think he'll show up in that Firewind deck. Vermilion Bird Lassie K-Tuna is a backup, 2CP, type 0, Jobless C. None of that is super relevant. We can't really search her. So what does she do? You can tap her, choose a forward. If it's put from the field in the break zone this game, review it from the game instead. Tap, put 3 backups into the break zone, choose 2 forwards, deal them 10,000 damage. The first time I read this card, I was incredibly high on this. I think this has the potential to be the next Kuchaspel, especially if there's anything that ever searches her. And they seem to like Type 0 as almost their fire backup engine right now between stuff like Miyu. I would not be surprised if they eventually just printed a card that searches a Type 0 character. And in that situation, she becomes maybe the best card to do that with. And I think that this is a card that, like Kuchaspel, would give Fire an angle that other decks don't have access to. Stopping floating effects, I think, is actually extremely relevant right now. Cards like Porum, cards like the new Griever, all of these cards have to go to the break zone for their triggers to happen. And Vermilion Birdless CK Tuna allows for Fire's removal to also essentially negate the floating effect of these cards for 1 CP. I think even the Macrocosmos Yuna from Opus 1 is maybe one of the most underplayed cards in the game because there are decks that will just straight up completely debilitate. Being able to say, actually, you don't have access to your break zone. And one of the reasons that Macrocosmos Yuna fell out of favor beyond costing 5 CP is actually that she's very breakable. And 2 CP is the right cost for an effect like this because 2 CP backups don't have to be good to see play. If anything the Crystal backups have shown, it's that you do not have to have a great 2 CP backup. You just have to be cheap and early to play. And she's absolutely a card you could jam 1 to 2 of in any mono fire list, and she's going to do well. And then the second effect is just gravy. Sometimes, late game, you could just threaten to cash her out and 3 random backups to kill 2 forwards. I don't think Garland's really going to show up anytime soon, but if he ever does, that's really good. You could go crazy by going then with like the Earth Fire Zondi and then pop 3 more things for, I think it's 8,000 damage each. There's just a lot of utility packed into one small card. And that first effect, I genuinely think has the potential to be meta-defining for Fire, in the same way that Kuchaspel turning off all protection was. I think that every Fire list should have at least a copy or 2 of her in here, almost as like a similar thing to the Kuchaspel, the Yagrosh that most water decks are on, similar things like that, where you're just debilitating the decks that actually rely on their break zone in the same way. She might be too expensive, she might not be searchable, which is going to cause issues, but I don't think it matters. I think when she's good, she's going to prove her worth by leaps and bounds over the competition. So, get a play set of this in foil if you don't. Warrior, another category 14 centered unit, 3CP 7k. You can put him in the break zone, choose a job warrior or card name warrior. Dull what it gains cannot be broken. Thank goodness for this text. I am so tired of Mira and Delusory Knight saying, actually, that thing isn't breakable and your entire combat phase is fated, because I'm going to just block with this idiot the entire time. That said, I don't think this goes. There's a lot of warrior support this set. This could theoretically go in there to protect the main centerpiece of that. I don't expect that though. I think there's just other better things we can be doing with warriors. So it's neat. It's a good limited card. I don't think it's going to define warriors this set. This though is going to define warriors. So Warrior has been a job that has not had any support for basically the entirety of Final Fantasy's existence. It's a very common job. There's a lot of cards that have it. I think almost every Category 2 character, barring Joseph, is Job Warrior. Mog 6s are all Job Warrior. Like, there's a lot of random warriors. The Water Fire Yuzuki is Job Warrior. Celestia is Job Warrior. Both of those have backups. Lots of very interesting things that Warrior Tribal could, in theory, do if there was an enabling payoff, which there wasn't until now. Meet the enabling payoff. When Tyvus enters the field, search for a Job Warrior, card name Warrior, add it to your hand. Already, banger. This search is backups in multiple colors. This search is a ton of very impactful forwards. Let me go ahead and just go on FF Decks. I'm just going to show off how many good warriors we have. Even sticking around fire mostly. I'm going to go flip this so we see recent. Starter Furion, other Furion, almost every Furion's Job Warrior. There are a lot of clouds that are randomly Job Warrior. This one's not super great. Again, more Category 2 stuff. Ramza is randomly Warrior here. Another Cloud Warrior. Like, again, you start seeing how many cards that when you can search them and deploy them for free. Axstar, the search is Axstar and then immediately plays Axstar for 5 CP. That's not bad at all. Maria is always an interesting card. Guy, I think, is really interesting. Again, Mog if we're generating crystals. There's a fire backup in Red 13. We have Yuzuki, which is great. L is, I think, actually a really interesting card, as draw 2, discard 2, kind of just turbo into your deck to find your payoffs. If we ever need a deep draw deck, L is going to help enable that, I think, potentially. Lots of Earth stuff. Backups, there's a Celestia. Let me go ahead and put this for just backups, because this is a 5 CP card that searches a wind backup, a water backup, and 2 fire backups, which is really interesting, and plays them. So in a fire deck, you can, in theory, get a water backup into play without having a water card in hand, which is actually really important as well for something like a Warrior of Light deck. Maybe you're like majority Earth Fire to run like Bosch, and then you use Tyvus to search Celestia and then deploy Celestia, so you have your water backup in play. So I think there's a lot of very interesting things that this card enables and does. Is it going to be meta-defining? I don't know. It's going to need a lot of playtesting, I think. But I think if it does, Tyvus is the reason to play the deck. Neon. Okay, so this is where I get really, really excited. Stranger Paradise is a game that I speedran at RPG Limit Break 2012. I love this game. It's super, super cool. And I think these are some of the most interesting cards we've had in a long time. So there's 2 separate cycles going on here. There is the Party for Jack, which are all essentially SOP support, where if they enter the field while you control another SOP character, which is intended to be Jack, then you get a bonus effect. The other SOP forward in each element is mono, which I think is actually really interesting, because what that means is if you run a dual element deck in any of the Warrior of Light colors, you could play Jack plus the party members in those 2 elements to have 9 Stranger Paradise forwards that all have very relevant text. But even if you're in just mono, you can still go Jack to search search the party member in that element along with the Job Chaos on that element. Which I think is a really interesting design decision, because it turns Stranger of Paradise into one of the most flexible engines that we've probably ever seen in the game. I think the comparison that comes to mind for me is actually Soiree, except Soiree was a deck that was its own engine. This is an engine that fits in any element combination that's already in the Warrior of Light colors. So is that actually worth it? I'll talk about it a bit more when we get to Jack, because I think that all of these cards need Jack Garland to be interesting, which means you have to run a dark card at 3 as an engine requirement, which is going to scare people off of it. But I think that we've established at this point that we can run 3 of light or dark cards if they're good enough as engine requirements, and they'll be fine. Shinryu is a card you run 3 of as an engine requirement when you run Shinryu. That card is incredible. It defined the meta last set, in my opinion. Lightning is a engine requirement for 13 that you must run 3 of. Absolutely meta-defining in the set she came out in. We are more willing, I think, now to run light and dark cards. Chaos. Or Chaos Arc. You're running 9 dark cards as an engine requirement to play Chaos Arc. I think that we're okay playing those dark cards as the engine requirement, as long as the payoffs are worth it. Let's see how the payoffs are. If it's Fire Forward or SOP FFO Forward deals damage to a forward, damage increases by 1,000 instead. It's fine. It's not amazing. It's not a reason to play the card, but it's a handy bonus. When Neon enters the field, choose up to 2 forwards. If you control 2 or more category SOP FFO forwards, deal them 7,000 damage. Notably, Neon's first effect will apply to this one. So, for essentially a 5 CP forward, because you go Jack for 3, search Neon, cast Neon for 4, you pick 2 forwards and do 8,000 damage to them, which is a lot. 8,000 breaks every single 13 field. If you go first, play a backup. Your opponent goes Vanille Hope, search the Lightning. You can proceed to go Jack Neon, kill both of them, which I think is even better than what I was doing last set with Xenos. And Xenos is a card that almost one-carded 13 in the matchups, like when you saw him at the right times. I think that this does similar things as far as handling aggro, which I think is really, really good. I like it when cards have the ability to stop aggro, which I think is the best thing that SOP does. You get a 9k Brave forward for essentially free, along with some bonus effects on everything else, which in this case is killing 2 forwards. I think this is really good. I think it's going to see a lot of play, but I think it's going to see a lot of play as a generic utility engine. So I'm looking forward to seeing Neon show up in a whole bunch of lists. Bahamut, we have another hero cycle of summons. So during your turn, the cost required to cast Bahamut is reduced by 2. Choose a forward, deal it 10,000 damage. Cannot be reduced if it's put from the field in the break center, removed from the game instead. This is the We've Had Enough of Your Bullshit Rydia card. The biggest problem with this card is this first line of text is very limiting, actually. I think the main reason to play summons is to play on your opponent's turn. When you're doing it on your turn, a lot of that utility kind of goes away. That said, 3 CP for essentially this is the FF13 Bahamut with bonus text for 1 CP more. And I don't think that's obviously very, very strong. So I think it's really interesting. I think it's going to see a lot of play. I think this probably replaces any decks that were still on something like the Crystal Bahamut, I think, where it was, 9k for 4, but 2 discounted on a Crystal. I don't think that that's ever really worth running over this anymore. I think this probably replaces the Type 0 Bahamut as well. I think it costs a little bit more, but the extra utility of removing it from the game and not needing Kuchaspel to hit things that can't be the damage reduced, I think is really nice. 10k breaks effectively every forward in the game, especially with the cannot be reduced text. This is just a 3 CP kill spell on your turn. Is that enough to see play now? I don't know. I think that this is probably a 2 of in most fire lists moving forward, behind the 3 Amaterasu. It's competing with the Brynhildr slot, essentially. Fel Thanos. This is another one of our heroes. It is a 5 CP 9k forward job eagle, category 12. Category doesn't matter as much here because it costs more than 4. We can't cheat this into play with Fran. When your opponent uses an EX burst, Fel Thanos deals your opponent 3 points of damage. This is just straight up comedy. If your opponent uses 2 EX bursts while Felthanos is on the field, they just frickin' die. Does that really matter? Probably. Basically, this card says your opponent does not have EX burst because they will not take EX burst unless they are very, very certain that taking 4 damage from that one is not going to kill them. That said, 5 CP to turn off EX burst is a very high investment. I don't think that would see that much play as is, but I could be wrong. I would think you need like a 3 CP card that just says, like, on the turn this is cast, turn off EX burst, but definitely, like, maybe it could be a checkmate card where, like, if you set up the right, like, maybe like 13, like, as a 1 or 2 of, put this in there so your opponent just can't EX on the turn you go all in if you have, like, the cards in hand. I don't know. I think it's interesting. That would not be enough to see play by itself, so they gave it a second line of text. When it's put from the field into the break zone, choose 2 forwards, deal them 9k. So this is trying to give your opponent a Sophie's choice. Either they can never use EX burst while Felthanos is on the field, or they kill the Felthanos and he's going to take 2 forwards down with him for 5 CP. However, it's reactive. It's not proactive. You don't get to choose when you kill the things. So there are going to be times that this is going to be a 5 CP card that doesn't do anything, and in those situations, you've probably lost the game. I think it's interesting. I think it's nice to see them try to print EX Burst counterplay this set. There's a lot of cards that actually deal with your opponent using EX Bursts. I think Felthanos is maybe the most high roll, but the most powerful of those cards. So I think you'll see some experimentation. I just don't really know where. Bomb. Bomb is a 1 CP monster. It's a common monster cycle this set. For 1 fire, tapping and sacking him, choose a forward, deal it 4,000, and then search for a bomb and play it onto the field. There's a lot of good bombs. I think that the 2 CP forward that does 5k on entry is a pretty interesting one. It can search itself, so this is like another Magissa target that fuels Magissa, technically, where you tap it back up to play the bomb, and the next turn you do fire plus sack the bomb to get a bomb for the next turn. Magissa doesn't usually have backups, which is why I think Hedgehog Pie is still going to be preferred. But it's a lot. It's very goblin-y, just a lot more expensive than goblins. I don't think this will overtake Goblin ever as an engine piece, but it's not a bad card. Especially because if they ever print like 3 CP bomb or 4 CP bomb, it's only going to get better over time. Marowith. So this is the chaos side for fire for the SOP forwards. So these all have 2 effects. One is just a generic enter the field effect that happens to go with the elements. So it's fire. When Marowith enters the field, choose a forward, deal it 8,000 damage. And then we have a second effect for every one of these chaos that says when you control 7 or more characters of their element, you get a bonus effect. In Marowith's case, you get to choose 2 forwards and give them haste. I think this isn't bad. I think that the 5k power is actually a little annoying. This really should be just a 4 CP 8k probably. But giving 2 forwards haste is actually a lot. Usually when people are accommodating for haste to avoid lethal, they'll sit on like 5 damage, in a spot where put themselves in a situation where 1 hasted forward doesn't end the game. Marowith has the ability to say, actually, you're taking 2 damage this turn when you thought you were only taking 1, and that's actually really powerful. Is that what Fire's looking for? I think Hien does the job a little bit better, but there's a lot of utility here. So if you're already in mono Fire, and maybe you already want to play Neon for killing 2 things and as an anti-aggro card, maybe Marowith does go in that deck. There's like a mono Fire mid-range. I don't know. I think it remains to be seen. I think this is one of the weaker of the job chaos, though. Just because that second effect is kind of situational. You do have to have a forward other than Marowith on the field, which I guess could be Jack. No, actually, yeah, you could go like 5 fire backups plus a goblin or something. Marowith enters, targets herself and Jack, and all of a sudden you've got 2 really big forwards coming in for a ton of damage. So she's interesting. I think that you could run her. Mutsuki, Type 0, Agido Cadet. Um, it's the right job, because right now the fire backup engine is Agido Cadets. So when this was spoiled, it's a very interesting one. However, 3CP is more expensive than the previous Mutsuki. That said, the previous Mutsuki did not have text. So what does this one do? Well, when she enters the field, choose a forward, deal it 5,000. If you have 3 or more Type 0 characters, deal it 8,000 instead. This is not better than the current Mutsuki. It's actually kind of disappointing because this art's really, really nice. But like both of the Mutsukis that are currently in print, I think are just better than this card. One of them is like a really interesting like payload for like pinging off forwards and like being able to like cascade into more pings. Or you could just get a 2CP backup with no text. I think I would run a 2CP backup with no text before I ran a 3CP backup that did 5,000 damage. When I could run something like Mont Blanc, for example, and do the exact same thing so much easier than this card. Like, this is just so much worse than Mont Blanc in every way that I don't see this being the reason to play her over any other version of Mutsuki that we have. So, unfortunately, this one is a big swing and a miss for me. Monk, 2CP special standard unit, Warp 2 for 1 fire with Brave. This is not going to bring monks into fire or do anything particularly special. This is just strictly a cheap forward for limited. Very, very good art at least, but not much else going on here. Rain. Rain is a 3CP 7K job knight. That's actually relevant. Always really good to see more job knights, especially in fire. And Rain actually was a Fire Knight name that was not particularly good. Usually you'd run like a light Rain if you were playing a Knight's deck. That said, Rain is kind of particular. So Warp 2 for 1. I like Warp 2 for 1 more than other options. I think that's okay. But I also look at a card like, was it Soul last set, where it was Warp 2 for 1, and then it was a bit of a Faithless Looting, draw 2, discard 1 on entry if it entered due to an ability. Rain is essentially very similar, except instead of that, it's due 7. Although this is ability not due to just Warp. So this is another option for Megissa. If you don't want to run Ward, maybe you're a little worried about not having the fire characters to cast it, you could run Rain instead. Rain will do the 7k damage. And Rain also has haste, which maybe could be relevant for Megissa. Maybe you split, you go 1 Ward, 1 Rain. First one you pull out is Rain due to the haste, or if the bigger body matters, you can pull out Ward. But I think he'll see a little bit of play and some experimentation, but he's not really going to be an all-star anywhere. Rain. 2CP backup, Job Mirage Keeper, category WAF. Unfortunately, this is the wrong name for a WAF backup. If you're looking for WAF synergies, Rain is the most important name in WAF currently. This isn't going to go in a WAF deck, though, so that's fine. You can tap her, sack her to revive a monster of cost 3 or less, play it onto the field. You can only do it during your turn. It's good text. You can revive a Jin. There's a lot of keep stuff you can do. You can revive a Jin to pump up the damage from a fire forward, especially one that has first strike, to kind of sneak in a little bit of damage. You can revive a bomb to do some damage there. You can pull a hedgehog pie out. You can cheat in a monster off element. Maybe you're in a fire deck that really wants to play a Tomos, but you don't want to run any wind at all. So you could like search the Atomos, get it into the break zone, and then Rain, tap it to revive it. We need a Foolish Burial card before we'd ever do an effect like that, but like this is just good text. Sid Waff saw a lot of play in Ice for a long time for a similar reason. You could revive a Scale Toad with this if you were in like a Fire Ice control deck where the Ice cards discard, but if they overcommit, you board wipe them with Fire in the same way that you would in like the Earth for Fire Earth. She's just good. And then the last card in Fire we have is Leftia. It's a 2CP 5k common. Job Fusionist, not a relevant job. Category is FFBE, which there is some FFBE synergy. Lots of searchers and such. If you are Fire Summon or Fire character you control deals damage to a forward, increases by 2,000 instead. And then on damage 3, she gets to do 6,000, but she'll increase the damage herself to 8,000. So that's a lot of damage for a 2CP forward, but again, it only happens on damage 3. The buff is actually quite significant. Like, that includes by battle, so it's like a more vulnerable Jin, but it's a double Jin kind of. This plus Jin would mean that your like fire first strike forward is doing 3,000 bonus damage, which is really cool. I just don't know how easy she's going to be to protect. And I think for that reason, I think she's probably not going to see a ton of experimentation. But I think she's a cool card. I think she has a chance, just due to a combination of 2,000 is actually quite a bit, and the job is actually pretty good. So, remains to be seen. But that's it for Fire. Up next should be Ice, I believe. So, stay tuned probably in the afternoon for that.